And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to members of the Society for Conservation Biology around the world. I hope you're doing well wherever you are. I'm Tony Lynham, the president of SCB and conservation scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And today I have the great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Pascal Gagneux. So Pascal is a professor of pathology and anthropology at UC San Diego. He is interested in the evolutionary mechanisms responsible for generating and maintaining primate molecular diversity. His team is exploring the roles of molecular diversity in protecting populations from pathogens, as well as potential consequences for reproductive compatibility. And Pascal has studied the behavioral ecology of wild chimpanzees in the Thai forest in Ivory Coast, population genetics of West African chimpanzees, and differences in sialic acid biology between humans and great apes, with special consideration of their differing pathogen regimes. His great concern is that the current surge in interest for comparative genomics is not being translated into direct support for the conservation of primates in their endangered natural habitats. Well, Pascal is not only a brilliant scientist, he is a father and a husband, an artist, a linguist, a culinary expert in the truest sense of the word, and he's a great surfer. The title of his talk today is Anthropogeny, Explaining the Origins of the Planet Altering Ape. And this talk will address latest insights into the origin of humans and how this single species of primate became a planetary force. He will discuss biological aspects ranging from molecules, DNA, glycoproteins, antibodies, to societies, nature deficit syndrome, habitat destruction, field biology, agricultural and medical practice, and emerging diseases. And he's going to highlight how our species has become biologically enculturated. In other words, how distinctly human culture has profoundly shaped our biology. So without further ado, I hand you now to Professor Pascal Gagneux. Pascal.
Thank you very much, Tony, for this kind introduction. I'm going to share my slides here with you. Hopefully you can see this. Can you all see this? Excellent. And I shall. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Anthropogeny, Explaining the Origins of the Planet Altering Ape. As a little contrast here, you see the famous chimpanzee Frodo that Jane Goodall wrote a lot about, and a human astronaut who has left the planet and can look down on our planet. And of course, that begs the question, what are we doing to the planet now, as we have become the only species with a global planetary impact? A brief look at the planet, which we can now do with the help of technology such as Landsat imaging. You can see humans have spread across the entire planet. Meanwhile, our closest living relatives, the great apes of Africa and Asia, are still restricted to these forests in Africa and Southeast Asia. DNA comparisons clearly indicate that we are one of 300 to 600 species of primates. And in fact, two of these primate species, bonobos and chimpanzees, are more closely related to us than either are to other primates. There is, to my knowledge, only one other species of mammal that has such a planetary distribution, and that is the killer whales. So we actually share quite a few other things with killer whales, big brains among them. But I know of no other mammalian species that as a single species is truly periplanetary all around the world. So how would you compare the behavior of humans to that of our closest living relatives? Well, an apt analysis would be to look at our movement with airplanes between continents. This was pre-COVID. Even COVID didn't put a ding in air traffic, but you can see the pattern of air traffic in a single day of humans. Contrast that to common chimpanzees, where males, as here in Isa in southern Tanzania, males jealously control an area of about 30 square kilometers and are totally intolerant of neighbors. Bonobos have a little bit more social tolerance, but they hold fairly small, similar-sized territories and are not famous for traveling between continents. Now, my colleague Sarah Hrdy, a famous anthropologist, once proposed the following thought experiment. Think of an airplane with 300 unrelated male chimpanzees and have them fly from LA to Zurich. What do you think happens when they arrive in Zurich? Almost certainly, it would not be a pretty sight. Now, people usually chuckle at this idea, and we feel good about ourselves, how civilized we are, how socially tolerant we are, that we can sit in an airplane with 300 people and not kill each other. But before you feel too good about yourself, you should remember that we do terrible things with exactly the same airplanes. So really, this illustrates, pardon, how we can do the best and the worst things with our technology. If you take a dictionary and ask yourself, let's look at things that humans do, but the other apes don't. And in fact, no other animal does. You can take astronavigation, beekeeping, cycling, X-rays, yoga, or ziplining. There is no end to the number of things that only we humans do. Material culture, cumulative culture, where rather a chimpanzee here in West Africa that I studied over 20 years ago is using a hammer to crack a panda nut. It took this chimpanzee over 5 years to learn this. Many primatologists would agree that this is a type of culture. However, this culture has not changed. This technology has remained the same for thousands of years. We know that archaeology in West Africa has shown that chimpanzees there have been using cracked hammers. Contrast that with humans, where silica-based technology such as Oldowan hand axes, followed by Acheulean hand axes, by small hafted arrowheads, by pottery, by glass, by photovoltaic things, by computer chips. They really show you how humans build on ideas of others. And this is what is meant by ratcheting culture or cumulative culture. This is all material culture. I'd like to quickly ask you a question with regard to symbolic culture. If you look at this image, you can probably all immediately spot the human footprint. This is a photograph I took a couple of years ago in southern Tanzania near Lake Eyasi, where I was visiting the Hadza people. And my friend Sikwezi pointed to this footprint of a human that he immediately recognized. Not only did he recognize this was a human, he recognized which human it was. It was his colleague Philemon. And he immediately read the pieces and deduced that Philemon looked like he hunted zebras and was successful based on the pattern of the zebra footprints hoof prints that you see circled in orange. This happened all before he inferred correctly that the Datoga pastoralists nearby came through with a sandal print, and you can see the footprint of a bovid there, of a cow. So no, other animals don't do this. Many animals are very good at tracking. Think of your dogs, but they track the molecules of the animal, whatever they track, that touches the olfactory receptor in their nose. Humans, on the other hand, at some point became experts at tracking footprints. And people like Louis Liebenberg in South Africa have argued that this, in fact, is the beginning of hypothesis-based science. So why are we the only ones who can do this? And I would like to argue that this type of symbolic behavior has had a huge impact in what we do globally. We share symbols. These symbols appear in the archaeological records starting over 40,000 years ago, and they are exemplified by things like personal names. We do not know of animals that use personal names. We have kinship terms. These things allow the formation of tribes that through shared ritual, dance and music, sacred spaces, group identity, and lead to the increased capacity to cooperate with and, unfortunately, to compete against other groups. And I'd like to argue that this type of social cultural technology is what sets us apart in big ways. It doesn't make us better, but could make us worse than many other species with regards to the fate of the planet. So modern example of these same things are seen here, and you immediately see how these things can either be very good or quite scary. Now, what's amazing is that our developmental schedule seems to be delayed compared to the great apes. We grow up very slowly, we live much longer, and it takes us 3 decades to fully mature our brains, whereas chimpanzees are done myelinating their neurons by age about 10. So could this be a biological assimilation of culture? This delay allows for picking up concepts, and it looks like our brains are mostly copying devices, and what they target best is language. Think of it, the majority of humans on this planet are bilingual, at least. They speak 2 languages fluently, and they pick up these languages with no instructions. An exponential increase in learning words, thousands of words by age 3, and with an ease that we all lose as we age. Paradoxically, these slowly developing infants and children with a long childhood, actually, we as a species have a much shorter interbirth interval than the apes. 3.5 years in hunter-gathering humans, natural fertility populations before farming, then becoming even shorter with farming, compared to 6 years in the apes. This might explain why, despite our costly infancy and childhood, we have managed to conquer the planet for good and bad. At the other end of life, with aging, here's a contrast. Look at the age pyramids of 5 different wild chimpanzee groups compared with the Hadza foragers of Tanzania. This post-reproductive survival in females is incredibly important in humans. These women, who make up about 1/3 of the living adults, are absolutely crucial for helping newly weaned infants and children to find their food, such as digging up these incredible roots here, as my friend Heidi, who is in her 70s, is doing. It turns out this is not just seen in the Hadza, you also see this in the Aceh in South America and in the Khoisan or the Kung in Africa. And the only species of mammals we know that has such long post-reproductive survival in females are actually the killer whales again. But other than the killer whales and possibly pilot whales, most animal species, when they stop reproducing, they die. In humans, an adult female spends 30% of her adult life as a post-reproductive female, transmitting culture, ideas, and food to young relatives. So I would argue that both our technological and sociological culture, social aspects of culture, have changed humans. Our hand anatomy reflects the use of Acheulean and other tools. The shoulder anatomy is actually adapted for throwing projectile weapons. Our profoundly pro-social psychology, well documented in human children who really care about the well-being of others, out of the box. And the post-reproductive survival is seen to be adapted to cultural transmission. We all use fire. All human societies prefer cooked food. And there are several different aspects of our biology that seem to reflect the long-term use of fire to alter food, detoxify food, and give us access to virtually unlimited food supply. We can eat things no other animal can eat because they would have to detoxify it through enzymes, whereas we just cook it or ferment it. We use home bases, unlike all the other apes. Even our saliva seems to be adapted to language. It's more liquid than that of the great apes. And our brain has lateralized connections, massive superhighways of connections between Broca's and Wernicke's area that are present in the apes, but hypertrophied in humans, and they seem to mediate language production and perception. We blush. We are the only animal that blushes, and blushing happens irrespective of your pigmentation. It's more easily detectable in lighter skinned people. It's a reaction of your biggest organ, your skin, and you cannot control it. It only happens when you have an audience. You cannot blush alone. And it reacts to cultural norms. If I realize that I violate a cultural expectation or a norm, I will blush uncontrollably. I already mentioned this massively delayed development of the brain, which allows us to continue to develop brain connections and reinforce them and do away with ones that are not necessary under the influence of cultural systems full of symbols and norms and taboos and so forth. The studies on population genetics show clear effects of cultural mating patterns degrees of inbreeding that different cultures allow or don't allow. And these has effects on our genomes. The introduction of clothing gave rise to body lice. Much later, after farming, when we started, somebody found out we could steal milk from other species, has people such as my ancestors in European populations that mutated and fixed almost for the ability to continue to digest lactose long after we are weaned. And even things like your capacity to digest starch. When you chew bread or rice, it starts getting sweet. Those are your salivary amylases that we have in much larger numbers than the apes. And those of you who have ancestors from grain agricultural populations have more copies than those of you who might have ancestors who used to not do grain agriculture. So these are reflections in our biology of cultural practices. Some other examples include submarine hunting in populations in Southeast Asia, resistance to malaria, even things like in the high Arctic, where over the last 12,000 years, the Arctic Inuit populations have actually, many of them have lost the capacity to digest plant sugars, which are absent in those ecosystems. And in modern societies, many of us who decide to delay paternity or maternity, reproduction, we actually alter the germline mutation rate, because especially fathers, the longer they wait to have children, the more de novo mutations they have been shown to pass on to their children. So humans, having found this kind of magical app of technological and social culture, have had a huge impact on the planet. This is from a very interesting paper by Forby and Svenning from a couple of years ago, where they used ecological modeling to predict how many megafauna would be expected under the existing ecosystems. And the striking observation is that below is what you expect with a heat map of these ecosystems all over North America and South America and Eurasia. There really should be a lot of megafauna there that is not there. The top image is what you observe. What happened? Why is it that most of the megafauna that persists on the planet is restricted to Africa? That's a direct reflection of the animals in Africa having evolved with us. They were people smart. The African outside Africa had never seen this bipedal ape that walked in. This is why in places like the Ngorongoro crater, you can see 22,000 megavertebrates still together in mixed species. But every other continent has had mass extinctions of megafauna after the arrival or coinciding with the arrival of Homo sapiens. Now, we know that the planet has had very different climates over the last 7 million years. If you look at the oxygen isotope-based estimates of temperature here, you see that the planet was much warmer 7 million years ago when we split from our ape relatives. By the time Australopithecines arrived 4 million years ago, it got a little bit cooler. And then with the genus Homo, starts a time of major climate change where you have oscillation between hotter and cooler climate. And just in the last 20,000 years, you can see a huge change of a warming that then, since the Anthropocene, since the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, is now driven directly by human activity. So the last interglacial is the last warming period since the last ice age. And that's a very important time span, because this is when our ancestors started farming in many places around the world, from Papua New Guinea to the Huanghe Valley in China, to the Brahmaputra, Ganges Valley, Indus Valley, to Mesopotamia, to the Nile Valley, and then over in Central America and South America. Interestingly, the first settlements, such as the one in Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, southern Turkey today, seem to predate farming. These were hunter-gatherers that started settling. Why would they have started to settle? Well, there's evidence from the Middle East that hunting became so successful with the help of these amazing inventions. These are called desert kites that you can see from flying over the desert. And they are gigantic hunting traps. With the help of dogs that were domesticated, people were able to hunt a huge amount of animals. Probably they were too successful for their own good. They ran out of prey. They had to switch subsistence mode. This led to agriculture. Settlements became bigger and bigger. They led to cities. And so agriculture, which took place in the Neolithic, which is named this way because you have a new type of stone age, you also have pottery, has completely changed the game. Our species now started depending more and more on domesticated plants and animals. And it allowed us to pump out even more babies. You can have Irish twins, you can have babies every year. And of course, it was what made possible all our civilization, including this Macintosh computer that I'm talking to you through. But it also introduced poverty, poor health, plunder, politics, and power differentials. So it was a big trade-off. It was a deal with the devil. It made everything possible that our civilizations are proud of. But it came at an immense individual cost of humans having poor nutrition, very imbalanced nutrition, and being brutalized by the authorities that needed taxes to feed their armies and build empires. Some of the animals seem to actually have been domesticated even earlier, dogs being the first, as early as 30,000 years ago, and it looks like the domestication of pigs was probably also older than thought. So by now, you have places such as the East African, the Serengeti in Kenya and Tanzania, where in Tanzania, for example, you have between 4 and 6 million large mammalian individual wildlife. But you've got 33 million domestic cattle and several billion cattle on the planet, just to put this in context. So we have, we think of these wild places. Well, it turns out all these wild places are completely surrounded and partially overrun by animals that are very much not wild anymore, that we need to produce food, milk and meat and so forth. And the landscapes have been profoundly shaped. If you go to Yunnan, China, or to the Philippines, you will see these terraced rice fields that are epitomizing what humans can do with very simple means, but absolute backbreaking work and strict social organization, who decides who irrigates when and so forth. So if you look at the planet again and you ask yourself, where can you grow things and where can you keep animals? Very often it's not the same places. And humans are pretty much making use of all these places. Where we can grow food, we do, and where we can cut down forests to grow more cattle and animals, we also do. And this, of course, is directly reflected in what we could do in terms of numbers of people. You can see that we're now well over 7 billion people, and most of us live in cities. Have precious little experience with wild places. And so it's not too surprising that maybe people don't care about wild places so much if they never know wild places. Now, to feed all these people, we had to rely on a very important invention, which is the fixation of nitrogen from the air. Unfortunately, when you fix nitrogen from the air to make ammonia, you can make fertilizer or you make explosives. And when you store the fertilizer, it can explode on you. This was an explosion very much like the terrible explosion in Beirut last year that happened many years ago in the first factory to fix nitrogen, the Opau explosion, where stored ammonium nitrate blew up. The fertilizer can be used to great effect to produce more food. But it turns out that people around the world have very unequal access to fertilizers. Us in the rich countries overuse fertilizer, and a lot of poorer nations don't have access to enough fertilizer. The end result is that we use so much artificial fertilizer that the nitrogen cycle on land now, a third of that nitrogen cycle actually is represented by nitrogen we pump into the system, with some real ill effects that it pollutes waters, eutrophies water, and so forth. But without this nitrogen, we would not be able to feed half the world population. In the ocean, we similarly are harvesting like crazy. You can see here the harvesting effort versus the payback. And the more and more we try to fish, the turnaround, what we bring in is actually going down. So this is clearly non-sustainable. This is just to remind you, I'm sure several of you like to garden or are even farmers. I garden organically in my garden, but many people don't realize that without this nitrogen, we could only feed half of the world population. So over half of our food is directly due to the fixed nitrogen. This is the prediction of how many people we will be in the year 2100. And it could range from 9 billion to 12 billion. This is the average number of children per woman. And I recently looked up and was quite surprised, pleasantly surprised to see that actually we have reached replacement value of average number of children per woman on the planet is now 2.1. And this is due to, in part, to the COVID pandemic. So humans have a huge footprint on the planet. It's very uneven. There clearly are wild places left, but even the wildest places are now subject to human impact. And how much you have an impact on the planet is very much due to your lifestyle. If you compare electricity use in the United States to the rest of the world, you can see that in the US, the average person here uses 3 times more electricity than the world average. And the amount of trash that we produce is exorbitant. This is a landfill just on the other side of the campus here. And this is the infamous mid-Pacific garbage gyre, a huge patch the size of Rhode Island filled with plastic that comes from all over the world in a place usually considered rather wild, the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So human encroachment, as you are all very aware of, is hugely important for the impact on humans and on the planet. This is a new road in the Congo. These are newly cleared fields in West Africa where trees are cut and burned, and then people plant cash crops to try to make a living. And when you do this, you alter the interactions between humans and their animals, their domestic animals, but also between humans and wildlife. And that's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because it's one of the best roads to emerging diseases. This is an article from many years ago by Tony Fauci and colleagues that highlights some of the emerging diseases around the world. And it turns out many of these have to do with new encroachment, new contact opportunity between humans and non-human animals. To remind you that many of these diseases involve viruses. Viruses were not even known to science a little over 100 years ago. So even to Western medicine, viruses are actually a relatively novel concept. I'm happy to at least one good thing about the pandemic is more and more people appreciate the power of viruses and how many they are and how quickly they evolve. But we still have a very poor understanding of the total number of viruses out there and what they could do to us. Not all diseases are new. So TB, for example, which is caused by a bacterium, is as old as our species. A team of scientists in Switzerland, which actually includes my younger brother, Pascal Gagneux, several years ago have shown that you can track the out of Africa movement of Homo sapiens by the genetics of the tuberculosis bacterium. But there are 2 patterns. One is the old out of Africa with Homo sapiens pattern. And then much later, you have an overlay of the impact of colonialism from Europe to all the places that Europeans went to plunder from. Add to this uniquely human behavior of making fire on demand, which we still don't quite know how old it is. It is certainly 400,000 years old. It could be as old as 2 million years. Fire is fantastic. It allows you to cook, you stay warm, you can change the landscape, you can alter materials, but it brings people together every night to tell stories, and it damages their lungs as they tell stories. So there's a very interesting idea by Mark Tanaka and colleagues in Australia that fire-making behavior was actually a huge liability for diseases such as tuberculosis. So some diseases are new and many diseases are emerging. And there are diseases that have been with us for hundreds of years and they keep emerging. And a famous one is influenza A. So influenza A is a virus, an RNA virus, not unlike SARS-CoV-2, but it has a segmented genome. Viruses are so small, you cannot see them under a light microscope. They're only about 100 nanometers. A nanometer is 1 billion times smaller than your body. So they're only about 100 nanometers big. So you need an electron microscopy to see these viruses. And we know quite a lot about influenza A. We know that their genomes are segmented, which allows the virus to have a kind of sex. They can exchange segments, and that's highly pertinent because that allows novel viruses, novel combinations to reinfect humans and jump species. This is an example of what happens to influenza when it jumps from one species to another. And so there is a never-ending cycle of novel flu strains that are of great concern. Influenza A is really a virus that causes diarrhea in wild aquatic birds, where they pick it up very easily. You can imagine these birds here that land on water, poop in water, drink water, constantly infect each other. And so this is a very complex diagram that shows you jumps of influenza A viruses between species and into humans, back from humans to other animals. You all are utterly aware that there was such a thing as the Spanish flu. People have now luckily stopped naming viruses after places of origin. But back then, we try to blame the neighbors for where a disease comes. The Spanish flu, which was an H1N1 virus, was a zoonosis that came likely out of a bird, possibly through passage through a swine. And it led to 675,000 deaths in 1918 in the US. And you can see that we're approaching that number now in the US with regard to COVID. And I just read yesterday, we reached 40 million infections in the US. So if you look at a zoonosis over time, this notion that a virus from an animal jumps into humans and really bad things happen, these things happen again and again and again and lead to very different numbers of deaths. You can add to that figure here, what happened in 2013 to 16 in West Africa, Ebola. We were all extremely lucky that this ended up being very well controlled. There was a huge event of Zika virus. The numbers there are hard to find. And of course here, COVID-19 raging at the moment. So I'd like to now take you into the mindset of a virus. I mentioned a virus was 1 billion times smaller than you. Viruses contain genetic material. And you probably have all heard that our genome is the blueprint of life. It's an attempt at an analogy, but it's more complicated than that. Your genome never lives in isolation. Your genome is not a virus. So your genome is inside a cell. It contains 20,000 genes, 3 billion base pairs times 2 because you're diploid. And so when a gene is expressed to make a protein, this protein first is transcribed into mRNA. The mRNA is shuttled through the nucleopores where it finds ribosomes, and then proteins are made and they go through this stack of vesicles in a cell here, and they end up very often secreted or on the surface of the cell. And as they do that, they do not remain a naked protein. Most proteins, over half of them, as they go through this maturation process, they get modified by something called glycosylation or post-translational modification. So the protein that's encoded in the gene can have many different forms by the time it goes through this interesting assembly line process where other molecules are added to this molecule. And what this means is that if you look at different cell type, a sperm cell, a red blood cell, a white blood cell, or an epithelium, each one of these cell types will have these complicated sugar chains attached to proteins and lipids that give it a kind of flavor. Each cell type has a molecular identity. And as a landscape ecology, you would say, well, each cell type has a characteristic kind of a nanomolecular landscape on it. And this matters greatly because disease agents such as bacteria and viruses, they essentially depend on the precise recognition on the molecules on the surface of a particular cell type. HIV would be really happy to infect a leukocyte, whereas SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 really specializes on epithelia of your respiratory tracts. And these flavors are defined by glycosylation. So think of glycosylation on the surface of cells as a type of rainforest canopy covering the cells. And if you were to zoom in, looking at a cell membrane here with the inside of the cell, the outside of the cell, you have proteins sitting in the cell membrane, you have lipids sitting on the outside of the leaflet, and you have secreted free glycans, such as the milk glycans in mammals, and secreted glycoproteins that make up the extracellular matrix. Now, I want to direct your attention to these little pink diamonds here. These are the outermost sugars on all these sugar chains. These are called sialic acid. They're named after spittle or saliva, and they are 9-carbon sugar that is found at the end. It terminates the sugar chains in most vertebrates. That's the structure of it, but you can forget about that. Just think of them as little pink diamonds that are found on the surface. A better analogy for these cell surfaces is actually the kelp forest, like we find here. You can also find in Western Australia, where Tony Lynham is right now. And if you were a virus in your kayak approaching a cell, these sialic acid would be just like these bulbs of this big cistus sea kelp. And it would be the best place to recognize that you are near a host cell that you can then attach to and invade, to infect. And so this is a cartoon from a write-up in Science last year that was covering our work, that tries to briefly give you an overview of what's going on. You have one body cell here with a cell membrane and a thick, complicated sugar coat on it that ends up in sialic acids. You have another cell here, an immune cell, that also has its own characteristic sugar coat. And the immune cells carry proteins that can touch other cell surfaces to decide whether this is a self cell, it's a healthy cell, it's not a cancerous cell, and it's not infected. And parasites and viruses and bacteria, they can come in and they attach to those very same sugars. And your immune cells can actually use proteins to detect bacteria that come in like a wolf in sheep's clothing, coating themselves by these very same sugars so that they can evade your immune system. So you can see this is like an ongoing arms race between long-lived hosts with many, many cells covered with specific sugars and pathogens that can exploit these sugars to come in and to evade immunity. So I'd like to briefly take you to a very human-specific thing that happened about 2.5 million years ago. There was a mutation in the lineage leading to Homo sapiens. And this mutation was of a gene called CMAH. And this caused us humans to change the surface of all our cell surfaces, unlike what happens in the great ape. We only have one type of sialic acid on our cell surfaces. All the other apes and most other mammals have 2 different kinds of sialic acid. And to illustrate this a little bit more, so this is really what happens. This is the enzyme that was knocked out. Humans are a genetic, natural knockout for this enzyme, which means we are not capable of making this structure from this structure. The only thing that changes is 1 oxygen here. But it turns out this structure is antigenic. It's not recognized as self in humans, whereas this is the self-human sugar. Now, what this means is that this was a watershed event. Every one of your cells has tens to hundreds of millions of these little sugars on it. So if you made yourself really small, the size of a malaria parasite or a virus, and you looked at the red blood cell surface, that's what you would see. In humans, it would look like a monoculture of all these types of sialic acid, whereas in chimpanzees or orangutans or gorillas, you would see a mixture of these 2 different sialic acid on the surface. And this almost certainly is really important for the coevolution of human-specific diseases and possibly for the jump of animal pathogens from a non-human animal to the human animal. So this is just to illustrate it. It turns out you can make antibodies. And if you look at sperm of chimpanzees or humans and stain them with an antibody against this sugar, there is nothing in humans. And chimpanzee sperm are light up, are full of this non-human sialic acid. Now, it turns out that my group was able a couple of years ago to show that in New World monkeys, which are over 100 species of monkeys found in the Americas, in Central and South America, a similar mutation has happened much earlier than in humans. So this means that there's a whole bunch of monkeys in South America that, with regard to their cell surface molecules, look more like humans than our closest relatives do. And then another group in the same year reported that mustelids, including ferrets, and pinnipeds, that include marine mammals, also lost the same gene. And this is true for twice in bats and has also been observed in some other mammals, including sperm whale. So what this means is at least 8 times in the evolution of mammals, this particular gene was lost, and this causes some of these species to be more similar to each other than you would predict from phylogeny. So watch out if somebody says, well, if an animal is closely related to you, you're more likely to be infected by its pathogens. That's not necessarily true. You remember this complicated graph I showed you? Well, these are the species who also underwent the independent loss of this same gene that alters the flavor of your cell surfaces. So in the case of influenza A, it's very clear that the fact that birds also lost this gene means that bird viruses are pre-adapted to jump to humans. So it's kind of a perspective on biodiversity that is often not at the forefront of what you think about when you think about gene pools and genetic diversity. This is biochemical molecular diversity. So back to what zoonosis can do and what we can do about zoonosis. So without doubt, humans, the more we go into wild places and we combine that with cross-continental travel, we are sampling more and more wild animals, and depending on how we keep our domestic animals, we also bias things to having more and more jumps from diseases from animals to humans. So these are these spillover events where wild animals or other species can transmit a novel pathogen to our domestic animals or to ourselves. And the only way you can keep this in check is to have surveillance and then the right interventions when you detect a novel pandemic event. Through things like vaccination and other controls, you can prevent a huge amount of human death and a huge amount of non-human animal death. So I'd like I say a few things about vaccination immunization. The word virus is a Latin word. It just means poison. Back in those times, nobody knew what a virus was because nobody ever could see a virus. Immunization was discovered relatively late in the West, but there's a very old idea of fighting poison with poison in many societies from Africa to China to India to the Ottoman Empire, where people discovered that you could take scabs from people suffering from smallpox, inoculate them, called variolation, into people who were naive, and it would protect them from severe disease. In the West, it was only in the late 18th century where Edward Jenner actually realized he could use one disease to prevent another one. He realized that milk maidens who are exposed to cowpox by milking the cows then are completely resistant to smallpox. So he used cowpox to inoculate against smallpox. And this was the beginning of a very successful smallpox vaccine. Of course, vaccine is based on the fact that initially this was done with cowpox, and vaca means cow, so that's where the word vaccination comes from. Smallpox has a very high attack rate. It's R0, which is the number of individuals infected by each infected individual, ranges from 3 to 6. It turns out SARS-CoV-2 Delta variant that we all face right now has an R0 of 7. But smallpox has a very high fatality rate. It's a terrible disease that leaves survivors blind and scarred really badly. Now, you can imagine that people going around with a live cow with scabs from cowpox and inoculating people with stuff they take from these scabs was met with quite a lot of ill will. You know, people argued it was against the will of God. It introduces beasts into humans. It was actually linked to some serious infections that could go from a cow to a human. And you can see here a cartoon of people being inoculated, and there's bovid things sprouting from all their body parts. That sounds familiar these days, right? We all hear a lot about that. The net effect was smallpox was the first major disease that got eradicated. It's gone. You know, the virus still exists, unfortunately, in a couple of freezers in the CDC and possibly in some military facilities, but there is no smallpox on the planet now. Unfortunately, we still have monkeypox. Monkeypox can infect humans, and it can infect wild chimpanzees, as in West Africa here. It looks like the reservoir for monkeypox is a squirrel, including the Congo rope squirrel. In heavily hunted forests in Central Africa, people are now hunting squirrels, and this actually inadvertently leads to reintroduction of monkeypox. And that's a very big threat because our young people now are not even vaccinated against smallpox anymore, making them very susceptible to monkeypox. Monkeypox has been imported to the US via pet trade from West Africa, and luckily these outbreaks were controlled. but that's a huge concern of emerging disease people, is continued re-import of monkeypox. Another success story, almost success story, is what happened to polio. Polio is a viral infection where your own immune system actually ends up destroying viruses that attack your neurons. So very often it results in death or paralysis. This is an Egyptian depiction of somebody suffering from polio with a characteristically atrophied leg. The global incidence of polio has gone down thanks to an extremely effective oral polio vaccine. But you can see that we still today have a couple of places where polio persists. Unfortunately, this is partially due to the fact that when the US tried to track down Osama bin Laden, they used polio vaccine efforts to get blood samples, and that totally destroyed the trust in vaccination personnel. So maybe something to consider, what you use vaccination efforts for. I like to briefly address the terrible story of HIV. HIV is a retrovirus that is highly specialized of infecting our very immune system, which complicates making vaccines. We still don't have a vaccine to HIV, but HIV is clearly derived from a non-human primate immune deficiency virus, which is somewhat of a misnomer because most of these species can carry their own type of simian immunodeficiency virus, but they don't get immune deficient. And it looks that HIV-1, the most common, the big pandemic strain of HIV, was actually acquired through chimpanzees to humans. And the chimpanzees themselves actually acquired the precursor to this virus from several species of monkeys that they prey on. There are a couple of confirmed cases of gorilla to human transmissions, but they never led to a global pandemic. We still don't precisely know how this happened. We know that by 1900, there were people in Kinshasa who were infected by HIV, but it seems linked to incredible global events that include, the insane colonial brutality of Belgians and other Europeans, and the medical campaigns to eradicate sleeping sickness, where hundreds of people would undergo a spinal tap with the same syringe and so forth. The cities grew. There were free women who moved from the villages to the cities, and one of the way of making a living was prostitution. There was mass migration, forced labor, all kinds of social upheaval. And then this all combined with intercontinental medical aid, blood commerce from Haiti to the US, and sex tourism and people using intravenous drugs. So it was an absolute perfect storm that somehow allowed a chimpanzee virus that had jumped to a human to make it to humans. But it can go the other way. So this is an example of a paper from a couple of years ago that reports an anthroponosis where chimpanzees that are very closely studied by primatologists who are loving these animals. They are trying to conserve, they're trying to save these species. Unbeknownst to us field primatologists who go and study chimpanzees in very close proximity, as you can see here, these animals are completely habituated. There were 2 cases of transmission of respiratory viruses that would give you and me a sniffle. But these viruses can kill chimpanzees. And some of these viruses actually originate not from local West African populations, human populations, but from European populations, likely the researchers, the field researchers, who somehow did not take the right precautions and inadvertently transmitted these viruses to chimpanzees. I like to get to bats and end with bats in a way, because they're so important in what's happening right now in the world. So bats are amazing, one of the most speciose groups of mammals. They have very specialized biology. They are the only mammal that is adapted to active flight. And it turns out this takes a huge toll on their immune system, on how they react to fevers and to inflammation. So bats, as studied by many eminent bat biologists, Dr. Lin-Fa Wang from Singapore here, who keeps bat colonies in Singapore, both mega and microbats, has been able to show that certain antiviral defenses in bats have evolved to keep in check viruses, which allows these animals to survive with astonishingly high viral loads. In a way, it makes them into bags of viruses, and they are all very mobile, and they move to many different places, sometimes in close proximity to livestock or animals, and that's a problem. And this is nowhere, a very scary illustration of that is Ebola. Ebola is thought to be hiding out in two species of mega bats from Africa, the epauletic fruit bat here, and the very lovable hammerhead bat here with the male that is a lecking species making really interesting noises to attract females. Now, everywhere in Africa where there have been Ebola epidemics, there have been connections to these bats. And that's a big problem. We still don't understand how these bats keep these viruses in check, and we probably have a lot to learn from bat biology to prevent novel emerging disease. Now, sadly, bats themselves have been affected by new diseases, and a recent study has shown that bats affected by a fungal infection can actually start shedding more coronavirus. So there is a connection between diseases of the bats themselves and what happens to their immune system and how much of a virus of concern to humans they can shed. There is a huge effort in monitoring bats around the world, and one of the leaders is Dr. Zhengli Shi, who's been under massive attack by all sides for being the person responsible for engineering the Wuhan virus and terrible statements like that. In fact, her team, before the pandemic, wrote this paper in which they predict something very much like the pandemic. Based on the many findings of coronavirus in bats all around China. So unfortunately, one of the ugliest aspects of encroachment is that the encroachment itself is turned into a business model where around the world you have specialized markets and people who pride themselves in unsustainable hunting of wild animals. And that, of course, causes increased direct contact between wildlife and humans. And we have to think very hard about the balance between respecting cultural identity and the long tradition of eating things that to you and me might sound a little bit scary, and the actual direct threat formed by these things. So in summary, I hope to have convinced you, and you all know this intuitively, that humans have become a planet-altering force. This doesn't mean that we are better than any other species. In terms of planetary fate, we're way worse. We're an absolute horror scenario for the planet. Human contact with wildlife is ever more invasive, and it's the main facilitator of emerging diseases. Evolutionary changes at the level of the nano landscapes, 1 billion times smaller than your daily experience. The surface molecules are shared by several animal species, and they're not our closest living relatives, but they include species like bats, like the rhinoceros bats in China, where corona is thought to come from, and ferrets and marine mammals that get infected by influenza, and birds, of course. Wild animals can also be affected by novel diseases, and this can increase the chance of them spreading pathogens to humans. We have to stop the uncontrolled pillaging of wildlife animals for human consumption. We also have to rethink how we use animals in the context of emerging diseases, spillover infections, and antibiotic resistance in farm animals. And I really can only hope that these profound pro-social human tendencies will allow us to take better care of each other and the life support systems of our planet. Maybe we should hope that we blush a little bit more when we think of what we're doing to the planet. So with that, I'd like to thank you all, and also invite you to an open public online symposium that will happen next March through CARTA, the organization I helped to co-direct, named The Past, Present, and Future of the Anthropocene. And I thank you all for listening, and I hope we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascal. That was a wonderful presentation. And I would like to open up for questions now. Colleagues, if you have questions for Pascal, please either type them into the chat here or feel free to raise your hand and we'll ask you to present your question to him. All right, I have a question while we're waiting for others to raise their hands. So Pascal, my first question is the study of distant events in human origins not too much of an academic luxury? And how can it contribute to solving current issues, including conservation crises?
Oh, thanks. It's a very pertinent question. Two things. I have yet to meet a human who is not interested in human origins. So it's one of these very, very big questions, but it very much runs the risk of being an academic exercise. And, I would argue that there is a lot of biased knowledge, biased to the last 10,000 years. I have colleagues in the School of Medicine here that say, oh, life expectancy used to be 35 years before antibiotics. That means there were no old people. Well, you can directly falsify this by studying, ethnographers have shown that Acehs, Khoisan, Hadza, people around the world, they have old people. And these old people survive, especially old women survive long after they continue having their own children. And appreciating that humans have become so dependent on the transmission of knowledge and values is, to me, one of the ways that we need to utilize to solve the conservation crisis. So I think that there are insights about things that are really strange about humans, such as how long we take to mature. It takes us into our 30s, which means with 20-year-olds, you might still have a chance to change their way of consuming things, how much trash they produce, or whether they care about wildlife or not. With a 20-year-old chimpanzee, you almost certainly would not have that chance.
Sure. We have a question from Olvern. Is it safe to conserve and document the carriers of some of these deadly pathogens?
Very, very nice question. I unfortunately did not have time to point out that half of our genome consists of parasitic DNA, things like viruses that have become us. So viruses are a huge concern. We're all sick and tired of viruses at this point, but they are a key part of the evolutionary process. They actually are evolutionary agents. They introduce novelty. Things like the adaptive immune system of mammals and the placentas of great apes and humans have directly benefited from domesticating viruses and turning the viral proteins into gimmicks that now allow us to have a more invasive placenta, a more costly pregnancy. So the same is true for some obscure bat species somewhere that some people would argue just take them all out because they're just a liability. I don't think so. I think we have to consider biological diversity, the full package. It's the host and the pathogens of the pathogens. Very often, actually, you might have heard of phage therapy, which is a big thing here at UCSD, that your enemy's enemies is your friend. And so the understanding of what a phage might be doing to the bacteria that infect a wild animal might be the answer to one of the infection disease crises we have.
Wow. Another question from Rod. Thank you, Pascal, for your great talk. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how we can bring this kind of integrated thinking from the epidemiology of disease to the sociology of conservation of wildlife and the reduction in wildlife trade.
Yeah, that's also a really good question. And it's something I've struggled with quite a bit. I remember, over 25 years ago, when it became clear that HIV-1, the causative virus of the pandemic, of the HIV pandemic, is a chimpanzee virus. I had colleagues in Africa who would say, see, we need to use that to discourage people from hunting bushmeat. And I immediately thought, well, wait a second. The one solution is that they will just think, let's just go and shoot all the chimpanzees and the other great apes. So I think we have to think really, really hard how to weaponize, so to say, some of these findings. I find one of the really challenging things, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the societies are currently being split between large numbers of people who are dissociating themselves from anything based on traditional biology or evidence-based experimental studies of systems, and they immediately jump to eating ivermectin to treat COVID or something like that. So Another profound human trait I haven't had enough time to develop in this talk is how magical thinking to humans comes much easier to all of us than rational approaches to problem solving. So all of us are loaded with preconceptions and things we know are better because we've always been taught this is better. And so the sociology of conservation includes things like, well, who are you exactly, having exterminated all the big animals around Switzerland, in my case, showing up in Tanzania or Ivory Coast and telling people, you know, you shouldn't exterminate your big animals because we did that. And I'm sure all of you are much more aware of this. You face this every day, right? But so it's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer to it. But I appreciate that you're thinking about how we need to bridge what people are finding at the level of why a virus infects certain species, which might be immunology and molecular biology, and how you would translate that for the general public, especially in range countries where people depend on their interactions with some of these species.
We have a question from Jana. If you could change just one thing to help create a more sustainable human existence, what would that be?
Until a few weeks ago, I would have said population number, but as I pointed out, we just hit replacement value. So we're starting to plateau. You know, humans, one of the things that allows us humans to be pro-social in surprising way, even though all of us can be bastards in maybe even more ways, is that we have this thing people have called the theory of mind, that we have at least a certain ability to consider another human as having thoughts, beliefs, emotions. And it's very hard to test that in other animals, especially if they don't have language, because you can't ask them about things. So I wonder whether if we could increase this capacity to walk in another individual's shoes or sandals or lack thereof, whether this could make us, you know, more successful in blushing a little bit more. Yeah, and empathy is the word, of course. But it's tricky, right? As people in the Buddhist tradition have pointed out a long time ago, is the minute you start priding yourself on your increased empathy in comparison to others, you've just joined the club of people who need more work. Right?
One more question I have for you, Pascal. You stress the importance of language for human cumulative cultural evolution. Don't all animals communicate, and how can you state that non-human animals do not have language?
No, it's a very common question. It's a very important one too. So first off, absolutely all animals communicate in really complicated ways that we have only begun to understand in some cases. Think of bat echolocation. When that was discovered, right after the American military had invented radar, you know, people were just shaking their heads. No, how come bats evolved something millions of years ago that is cutting edge technology? So there's plenty of animal communication, which is fascinating, very efficient, and in modalities we sometimes don't even know yet. Think of the weakly electric fish of the rivers of Africa, for example. But by language, I mean a system of communication that has this characteristic combinatorial power. Human language is much more than just communication. It's a way you can combine things and create infinite meaning. So I can tell you stories. And so far, correct me if I'm wrong, we do not have evidence of a non-human species that tells a story. And telling a story means we share our brains. It goes back to empathy. I can relate to you things that happen in the brain of my great-grandfather through Zoom to another continent. And it's very likely that you will get what I mean. And that's something that's a lot of people are trying to get at it. I mean, do dolphins do that? Do orcas do that? There is some evidence for teaching by grandmothers in orcas, but there is zero evidence for orcas telling stories at this point. So its absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You know, but in humans, we have strong evidence that we can generate every story you can imagine. Think of the young people you know in your life, think of their imagination, think how they can just endlessly combine things and come up with these amazing ideas. And of course, because we're all much better at copying than at coming up with new ideas, the minute somebody comes up with a useful new idea, or it could be a useless new idea, we all copy it like crazy. Next thing you know, we dance Gangnam Style in Switzerland. And that's very powerful, both for good and for bad.
Well, one last question from me, Pascal. How can bats and humans resemble each other more than apes and humans with regard to disease susceptibility, if we shared a much more common, a recent common ancestor with the latter?
Yeah, it's a surprising finding that, you could say bat, or you could take a ferret, or you could take a curlew, a water bird here on the coast. So with regard of infectious disease, often the defining characteristic, whether a pathogen can make it across a species, has less to do with overall genetic similarities and more to do with the details of the molecular composition of, let's say, the saliva that is being produced. Most pathogen that you breathe in or ingest will actually look for molecules that allow them to make it to your cell so that they can get into the cell or into your system. And so because there is such a thing as convergent evolution, which is the independent evolution of similar things in nature, with regard to molecules, you have that too. Within the realm of biochemical reality, you can have a species as unrelated as a rhinophilus horseshoe bat in China and an African bipedal ape, Homo sapiens, that end up with a molecular configuration that for a particular disease, say coronavirus, looks just right. And so you'd be barking up the wrong tree if you barked up the phylogenetic tree. You need to consider that there are other dimensions than just phylogenetic relatedness. Case in point, chimpanzees cannot be infected with human malaria and vice versa. But Aeodus monkeys in South America can be infected with human malaria. And that's directly explained by these molecular changes.
Thanks, Pascal. Well, we've kept you a little bit past the hour, and we wanted to thank you so much for giving us your time, and it was just a wonderful talk. It was one of the best talks I've ever been to. So thank you on behalf of the Society for Conservation Biology, and perhaps we can get you to speak at our ICCB, which is at the end of the year, our International Congress for Conservation Biology. So I'd like to plant the seed there.
I'd be happy to. No, thank you all very much for listening, and you can find me through the Carta website, which I think Tony is posting somewhere. So if you have any follow-up questions or concern, or please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you all for your work, of course.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight, this morning, this afternoon. Goodbye to you all.
Bye, everyone.